So let me just introduce myself. I'm Mark Vopat, and I am the co-director with my colleague, Dr. Robin Geyer, of the Dr. James Dale Ethics Center here at YSU. So for those of you who aren't familiar with it, the Dale Ethics Center was a center created for the study of ethics across campus, across the disciplines. We sponsor events and talks, occasionally even guest speakers like tonight. The center was founded in 1996 by a donation of Rebecca Dale, the wife of Dr. James Dale. Dr. James Dale was a faculty member at YSU. And so it's through her generous contribution that we're able to put on these talks along with other activities on campus. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Geyer, and she's going to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Thomas Harter.
Okay, well, welcome. And it is truly my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Tom Harter, who is the director of the Department of Bioethics and Humanities at Gunderson Health System in La Crosse, Wisconsin. Dr. Harter also chairs the Gunderson Institutional Review Board and the Ethics Committee, in addition to serving as president of the Academy for Professionalism in Healthcare. While his accomplishments are numerous and include, by the way, a fellowship at the Cleveland Clinic, I am particularly excited that Dr. Harter is speaking with us today on a timely topic of ethical considerations of mandatory COVID-19 vaccinations. Dr. Harter served on the Wisconsin Department of Health Services COVID-19 Vaccine Allocation Committee, helping set state-level priority standards for vaccine distribution, and has already published on this topic. Several years ago, Dr. Harter served as a guest speaker for a class that I was teaching regularly in healthcare ethics. So I hope that you will quickly discover what I already know about Dr. Harter, which is that he is a thoughtful person and an engaging speaker. But what you might not know about Dr. Harter is that he holds a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, and a doctorate in philosophy. So to all you students out there, or to anyone who might have some doubt about that, philosophy is in fact practical and much needed in our society. And there's a lot that philosophers can do. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Harter.
Wow, what an amazing introduction. Thank you, Robin. As she mentioned, I was fortunate to meet Dr. Geyer a few years ago. Well, she was at Viterbo here in La Crosse, Wisconsin, and did have the opportunity to guest lecture in some of her classes, and always a real treat, just like this. This is going to be fantastic. And so one of the other things, first of all, the introduction is far too kind. I've also had just tons and tons of failures. So I know we always focus on the accolades, but it's okay to fail, and as long as you fail well. Remember that too, especially if you're majoring in philosophy. The other thing is, I just came, as I was telling Dr. Volpat and Dr. Geyer, coming from our own institutions, conversations around vetting religious exemptions for COVID-19 vaccinations. And so I know Youngstown State is having some conversations around that. These are conversations that are happening all over the country. Be happy to talk more about that. One of the interesting things that I'm not going to actually focus on explicitly is around religious exemptions to COVID-19 vaccinations, but know that it's couched in there when we begin to talk about the work on autonomy and the concerns about a vaccine mandate from the arguments of autonomy. So with that, I'll get started in earnest, and I am going to turn off my self view so I don't have to look at myself while I'm presenting, because that weirds everybody out when they do that. So again, I'm Dr. Tom Harter. I'm with the Department of Bioethics and Humanities here at Gunderson Health System. I direct the department. Here today to talk and discuss with you the contemporary and contentious topic of mandatory vaccinations in general and the COVID-19 vaccine mandates particularly. I'll start with the basic disclosure that neither I nor anybody in my immediate family have any financial conflicts of interest pertaining to anything discussed in the presentation. I also want to make sure that I say thank you to Dr. Robin Geyer and the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at Youngstown State and the Dr. James Dale Ethics Center for the opportunity to speak with you this evening. It is an honor. It's a real treat for me to be here doing this with you. So thank you for taking time out of your evening to hang out with me. I hope you will come away with this being like, that was the best hour and a half I could have imagined having on a Thursday night. I'm going to do my best to live up to that expectation. I have 4 basic learning objectives. One is to discuss the background of vaccine development, as well as the FDA approval process around vaccines. I'm going to offer a fuller understanding of opposition to vaccine mandates. I'm going to describe several justifications for mandates from the realms of business ethics, and medical professionalism, and public health ethics. Then I'm going to talk about, just briefly as concluding points, 2 additional issues with vaccine mandates that I'm not going to really address thoroughly here, but you should be aware of them. I'm also going to add a caveat here. While this presentation is educational in nature, it will primarily show how vaccine mandates can be ethically and morally justified. However, don't mistake this landing spot as an endorsement of vaccine mandates. What I do hope you come away with is a twofold appreciation of, one, that the default position is not to have a mandate, right? We actually don't want to have a vaccine mandate. We're at a position now where many organizations are saying we need to get our staff and we need to get people vaccinated. And that's as a result of incentives have maxed out, that we are now at a point of needing to mandate to get that last bit of, or the last groups of individuals in to get them vaccinated. And so the other thing, though, is that the arguments from personal freedom and autonomy are very strong here, right? And I want to impress upon you that I don't take those lightly, and neither should you. But those arguments are not without exceptions. So where does all this business of vaccine and vaccine mandates originate, right? Why does this talk even matter? So it's actually premised on evolution and morality, not speciesism, right? There's nothing in this presentation that attempts to show or argue that the human species is superior to others. I do claim that the human species is different. And what I take as my springboard is that the theory of evolution posits that most biological life has an innate drive to propagate their species. At both micro and macro levels, individuals of a species and species as a whole must adhere to this drive and adapt to environmental changes or risk extinction. And when we pause to reflect on the history of ethics and morality in the human species, we see how all moral theory is tied to this biologic reality. When we look at the basic philosophical question around ethics and morality, how should we act? The underlying motive and drive for the question is that existence and existing is a priori valuable. Utilitarianism, deontology, feminist, virtue, and of course, existential approaches to ethics all take at their core the value of existing, and as we'll get to at the end, the value of existing in relationships with others. So for humans, there are really 3 general categories of threats to existence. So first is climate change, including depleted and damaged ecosystems and natural resources, shrinking living capacity, and food insecurity. Then there's technology, right? Including the development and use of weapons of mass destruction and intelligent and adapting technology such as artificial intelligence and nanotech. And lastly, viruses. We all know what that virus is there on the screen, right? Viruses and other poor health conditions, including pandemic level and other incurable and untreatable diseases. All of these things are threats to our existence as a species. The cool thing is humans are actually pretty awesome when we want to be. And in fact, humans are the only forms of biologic life known on Earth to be capable of using their bodies and their brains in conjunction with one another to deeply reflect on these existential threats and understand scientific processes to create long-term sustainable solutions for the sake of future generations. So given the topic at hand, though, we're going to focus, of course, just on that third threat with viruses. So what you see here on your screen now is a mugshot of 2 of humankind's greatest killers. Together, these 2 mass murderers, the smallpox virus on the left and the flu virus on the right, have caused an estimated 31 to 128 million human deaths. Some estimate that smallpox deaths alone number approximately 300 million. Only the bubonic plague has a higher historical death toll. But again, the bubonic plague, that's bacterial, it's not viral. The history of virology is fascinating, and I recommend, if you have the time, reading Milton Taylor's A Short History of Virology, which is available from the National Library of Medicine, in which he addresses not only the scientific elements of viruses, but also the philosophical question of whether viruses are living creatures. The only thing you might want to know for this talk is that viruses are essentially chemicals that contain RNA or DNA and effectively exist in two stages. One, as inert chemicals, and then two, as active reproducing organisms once they connect with a host that provides the necessary protein to feed its growth and multiplication. You think cockroaches are pretty disgusting? A single virus organism, once attached to a host, can replicate millions of times. Evidence shows that humans have been experimenting with vaccine development since around 1000 CE. Focusing just on smallpox, records show humans in China and the Middle East would rub smallpox pus on non-infected individuals or blow ground up remnants of smallpox scabs into the nostrils, believing the body would develop a natural immunity. It's a good thing you all aren't on camera, because I bet you'd be pretty disgusted by me saying that. But it was a basic observation by English physician Dr. Edward Jenner that ultimately led to the creation of the first lab-created vaccine for smallpox. Dr. Jenner noticed that milkmaids rarely contracted smallpox. They would, however, develop cowpox from touching the wounded udders of infected cows. Cowpox in humans is far less severe than smallpox. It caused some localized ulcers on the skin and, in rare cases, fever and malaise. Smallpox, however, causes fever, lethargy, headache and vomiting, rashes, and sores inside the mouth, throat, and the nose. It lasts about 3 weeks. The problem is it has about a 30% mortality rate that happens in the second week of the disease. So it's one that doesn't last long, but it's certainly one that has a much higher death toll than something like cowpox. In 1776, Jenner took the cowpox pus from his handmaid who had been infected by a cow named Blossom, whose hide has been immortalized in the St. George's Hospital Medical School in London, which you see here. And he used it to inoculate the son of his gardener, James Phipps. Jenner then exposed Phipps to smallpox with no reaction. He replicated this experiment 22 times with the same results. I should also note that the term vaccination was coined by Jenner. The root word vaca is a Latin word for cow. So is bovine, but vaca is also Latin for cow. As news of Jenner's success vaccinating against smallpox spread, so did the study of virology, which eventually led to the ability for scientists to isolate the cowpox virus and replicate it using lab-based technology. So those of you listening to this presentation, the majority of you, especially those of you under 50, which is going to be almost all of you, might be thinking to yourself, wait, I've never been vaccinated against smallpox. That's right. The US stopped widespread smallpox vaccination in 1972. This is because the last recorded case of smallpox in the United States was in 1969, and the last recorded case in the world was in Somalia in 1977. This is a picture of Ali Mawa Malan, who became the last person known on Earth to contract natural occurring smallpox. It has now been completely eradicated. I want to pause here for a moment to impress the importance of what I just said. Smallpox was a deadly virus responsible for millions of deaths. Within 200 years, from Jenner's initial experiments in 1776 to the last case of smallpox in 1977, it was eradicated. It's no longer a threat to humankind. This feat was not just a function of the creation of the vaccine. It was a function of scientific inquiry, governmental cooperation in resource expenditures across nation states, and public policy and public health campaigns, including mandatory vaccination programs, especially of school-age children. And like what we're seeing with COVID-19, there was notable opposition. School vaccination became required in circa 1922. And in 1925, there was a smallpox outbreak in Milwaukee, not too far from where I am, in which 386 people got smallpox. What's interesting about that is of those 386, 87 of them died. That's actually not the interesting thing. The interesting thing was of that 386, 327 had never been vaccinated. And 57 of those individuals, their vaccinations were more than 5 years prior to the outbreak. So as I begin to pivot to the ethics of vaccine mandates, there's 3 takeaways. 1, vaccines work, but sometimes lose effectiveness over time, requiring boosters. 2, disease management can be a slow or a quick process relative to time. And 3, vaccine mandates are not new and have been utilized before in the United States for the sake of public health. So before sinking our teeth fully into the meat of the presentation, I want to briefly touch on vaccine approval processes in the United States. At present, there are 27 families of viral diseases for which there are approved vaccines in the US, including COVID-19. All of them had to go through standard scientific research processes in which basic research is done to identify and validate viral targets and agents that can hit those targets, similar to the cowpox virus being observed to neutralize the spread of smallpox virus. Once promising agents are identified, they're vetted for fuller development and feasibility. These 3 steps, target identification, agent identification, and feasibility, help whittle down potential agents from thousands to hundreds to just a few, at which point scientists move into the clinical study phases, which is in the United States a 3-phase process. The phase 1 assesses the safety for use in humans, phase 2 assesses appropriate dosing, and phase 3 assesses efficacy and long-term safety. These phases are about numbers, not time. The larger the data set, the faster the process can move along. Once those studies have been completed, they're submitted to the Food and Drug Administration for regulatory review and approval. If the FDA agrees that the vaccine is safe, it then gets approved for manufacture and distribution. I'm not going to address here questions related to research ethics other than to say there are examples of the breakdown of this process and the method for approval, which has led to legitimate concerns and vaccine hesitancy. So I don't want you to walk away from this talk thinking that the vaccine approval process is flawless. It's not, but it's a process that has checks and balances. What I will briefly address, because I think it would be remiss not to, is the worry that many people have, or at least had, about the initial approvals of the COVID-19 vaccines under the emergency use authorization designation. Very quickly, full FDA approval means that all the available information about a vaccine has been fully reviewed and verified by FDA authorities. An EUA designation, the emergency use authorization, still qualifies as FDA approval, but rather than having reviewed and verified all available information about the vaccine, the FDA partnered with outside organizations to vet the vaccine's effectiveness and safety toward addressing a public health emergency as determined by the Director of Health and Human Services. The initial EUA approvals of the COVID-19 vaccinations meant that there were no identified safety concerns from national or international partners, and that full approval was granted to the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines recently, once the FDA authorities had effectively double-checked and verified the work of their partners. So this, I think, offers a nice segue into the ethics of vaccine mandates in general and COVID-19 particularly. When speaking of vaccine mandates, what I mean is an enforceable obligation by which eligible persons are required to have a vaccine, regardless of their preferences. This does not mean that persons who do not want to be vaccinated will be held against their wills and coercively given shots. Rather, mandates should be understood as conditions or criteria under which having a vaccine is needed to participate in a variety of events or activities, such as going to work, school, concerts, etc. And in which, if accommodations are unavailable for someone who is not vaccinated, the lack of vaccination would result in being denied access to participate in those activities or events. The purpose of vaccine mandates is to inoculate as many persons as possible against the disease targeted by the vaccine. To be clear, vaccine mandates can and should only apply to those eligible to receive a vaccine. So with at least respect to the COVID-19 vaccines, those mandates don't actually apply yet to children ages 11 or younger, or those at risk of having an allergic reaction to the vaccine components. Right? That those are medical reasons why we would say those individuals are exempt. Right now, I am a philosopher by training, as Dr. Geyer formally noted and appropriately noted. And good philosophy, because it's important to think about good philosophy. Good philosophy expects one to demonstrate the strength of an argument by accurately characterizing the arguments that you're arguing against. And believe it or not, Dr. Geyer did not tell me to say that. That is actually what I wrote as I was thinking about this. So we're of the same mind. To that end, I'll say I've been disappointed a bit with how the viewpoints of vaccine mandate opponents have been characterized and treated, including by those in the bioethics community. Those who support vaccine mandates tend to characterize the arguments of those opposed to them in terms of liberty or tyranny, and then counter-argue that liberty still requires personal responsibility. While that's true, right, and that liberty is not and should not be unfettered, characterizing vaccine mandate opponents via this simplistic liberty argument diminishes what seems to be their actual underlying concerns, which risk committing a straw man fallacy. So I'm going to try to offer a fuller account of why some individuals oppose or may oppose vaccine mandates. So arguments against vaccine mandates in general and COVID-19 in particular are rooted in both ethics and law. Certainly liberty plays into this, but what matters is how liberty is threatened by vaccine mandates. The foundation of the US Constitution is the right of individuals to make personal choices for how they live their lives, so long as individuals do not infringe on the rights of others. This is really the heart of the matter regarding the treatment of COVID-19 and the threat of COVID-19 and the vaccine opposition. What this legal right is based on, though, is the more foundational moral belief that individuals ought to respect the autonomous choices of others. Certainly there are exceptions. Cognitively underdeveloped, impaired, or compromised individuals who cannot adequately process information typically have others help them with decision-making. And legally, we do not restrict individual actions for the sake of others to make other people's rights to live and self-govern, or we set those as components to make sure that they're not unfairly impacted. Traffic laws, restrictions on certain kinds of speech, shooting guns in urban areas all fall into this category of restricted action. But getting vaccinated is a different kind of action. It's not just behavior modification that requires restraint or refraining from unsafe actions. It's an act of having something done to you. Now, people often accept having things done to them by others, especially in medicine. But basic foundations of medical ethics and consent laws require obtaining permission before giving a treatment. Vaccine mandates threaten this norm by invalidating the voluntariness of accepting a treatment, which is why some people claim vaccine mandates are unfairly coercive. It's not being told that one must get vaccinated per se that's at issue, nor is it necessarily a stance against vaccines, but rather it's being told one must get vaccinated or be punished in some way that is seen as the problem. Related to this point about vaccine mandates violating the commonly accepted and practiced respect for individual autonomy is a concern about risk. The scientific data available for the COVID-19 vaccines show that a very small percentage of individuals will have a negative reaction to the vaccine, approximately less than 1%. And while they can be bad, right, don't ever confuse the numerator for the denominator, right? So even though the stories about how bad the vaccine can be are the ones that get talked about on the news especially, right, the actual numbers show that less than 1% have this extreme negative reaction. But it frequently produces short-term side effects, that we know, right? The argument from risk is that it is unethical to require people to take on risk to help others, however small. Altruism is not a legal or moral requirement. This is why altruistic action is considered morally praiseworthy, and it's a reason compulsory military service and Good Samaritan laws are considered contentious. We want individuals to help others out of a sense of obligation, not because they were forced to. Another argument against vaccine mandates is that they do not address historical injustices against disenfranchised minority populations who have been subjected to medical and research coercion. There are individuals in these groups who understand and appreciate the negative impacts of pandemic-level threats who do not oppose mitigation strategies or vaccinations per se. but who maintain a deep distrust of authorities demanding vaccine compliance and implementing mandates with the threat of punishment for not being vaccinated. Frankly, I don't think those in the medical community have done enough to earn the trust of these populations. When we listen to what individuals in these populations say about how they continue to be systematically marginalized with the current pandemic structures of healthcare, or current paradigmatic structures of healthcare, I should say. That's all to say, when you have a vaccine mandate and a group of people who question or distrust the motives behind the mandate from a historical perspective, and there is no apparent meaningful conversation to address the concerns of these populations, having the mandate exacerbates an already bad relationship, not helps make it better. So how do you begin to address all this? I don't suspect those of you who are listening who are strong opponents to vaccine mandates will ever be convinced of them being ethical by anything I say during this last portion of the presentation, but I'm going to give it a shot. I'll start with the business case since I think it's the weaker of the two. From the realm of business ethics, there are two dominant perspectives about the purpose of a business: to be socially conscious, which is what we see here in terms of stakeholder theory, or to make as much money as possible, as exemplified here by the quote from Milton Friedman that the only social responsibility of business is to maximize its profits. As we've seen with COVID-19, pandemics threaten economies. And when you live in a country like the United States that utilizes a market-based system to provide for people's general needs, including healthcare, economic threats are effectively threats to individual, community, and national security. People get sick, they can't work. If they are sick or can't work, then they can't afford to purchase the goods or services they need to maintain a basic level of functioning, such as food, shelter, clothing, and healthcare. We've also seen that in order to help people from getting sick, strict mitigation strategies can be implemented, such as restricting work hours or the numbers of people served by a business, all of which can negatively affect profitability, mostly because of a combination of the cost of implementing mitigation strategies, a reduction in the amount of business that can be conducted quickly, and a subsequent impact on supply chains. Small and mid-sized retailers and restaurants in the United States have been some of the most negatively impacted businesses during COVID-19. The problem is cyclical. So again, if you have a populace that's ill or at high risk of becoming ill, then they can't work to earn an income. And if people can't earn an income, they can't afford things they need to protect themselves from getting ill or help them get well. In order to get back to fast-paced profitability, it then behooves businesses to do whatever is necessary to eliminate the threat of disease by the fastest, least restrictive means possible, which would be through vaccination. If we come back and consider the purpose of business being, oh, hold on one second, shut down later. There we go. If we come back and we look and consider the purpose of business in terms of being socially conscious, in which the business exists to improve the lives of all people and not necessarily to maximize profitability, it follows that businesses will want to support vaccine mandates toward diminishing and ultimately eliminating the threat of disease, certainly for the sake of its own staff, but also for its customer base and more broadly, all of its identifiable stakeholders, those who are impacted by the function of a business. And clearly, this is where the US government strategy lies currently with its new requirement that all businesses with over 100 employees implement vaccine mandates or pay hefty fines for infractions, right? Infractions in the name of, or the range of 70,000 to close to $1 million. And when we look at vaccine mandates now from the side of public health ethics, medical ethics, and medical professionalism, the case is even stronger. The different principles and values within the realm of medical ethics and medical professionalism demonstrate how vaccine mandates is an ethically supportable, or at least for employees in those environments. If one considers the concepts of justice, fairness, beneficence, and non-maleficence, there's clear support for hospitals and health systems to maximize patient and community safety, protection, and health by virtue of its own policies and actions. While the principles and values within medical ethics and medical professionalism typically speak only to medical professionals, namely MDs or other similar level clinicians, the general concepts do not suffice in maximizing patient care unless they confer some similar obligations to others who assist in caring for patients. This is to say that anyone who potentially impacts direct patient care by virtue of their employment within a hospital or health system should take on some professional responsibilities to ensure optimal care of the patient. It's through this idea of care of the individual in which we see overlap with public health ethics, which takes as its central tenet the well-being of the public in ways that can and do justify limits on individual actions. As a couple of colleagues and I recently argued in an op-ed that's being published under the Health Affairs blog, the concept of liberty, while grounded in autonomy, is exactly the reason there are various limits imposed on individual actions. To ensure liberty for all, public safety measures, at least within democracies, are utilized to prevent individuals from inadvertently harming others. Again, this is why we have traffic laws, laws about smoking in public places or recklessly using weapons in urban areas. So at this point, I suspect some of you might be thinking, yep, totally agree. People should get vaccinated, and at least in the realms of business and medical care, employees should be obligated via mandates to be vaccinated. And there are some good reasons to expect customers and patients in those individual spheres to be vaccinated when obtaining services. And this scope should be broad enough to get us to a wide swath of coverage that would help us get near to the numbers needed for herd immunity, which is about 80%. And if you thought all of that over the last 2 minutes, that's really robust, and congratulations, that's awesome. And to those of you who might be thinking that, I say, great. I think we're of a similar opinion. Others of you might be thinking, wait, hold the phone. Even if we grant that the arguments from business ethics, medical professionalism, and public health ethics establish a fiduciary duty of workers and businesses and medical care to be vaccinated, those arguments aren't strong enough to justify a mandate, given the previous arguments you highlighted and the fact that the arguments toward justifying a mandate don't meaningfully address concerns about risk and historical injustices to certain populations. And to those of you, again, I say congratulations if that was how robust you got in your thinking just now, but great, we're of a similar opinion. And I think we have to do more. So what I'm going to do now is add another layer or two to the mandate justification that I think is probably broad enough to cover these other two important points about risk and historical injustice. The concern about risk is actually trickier than I've made it appear so far. The reason is that because moral theory, by and large, does not know or have good mechanisms for addressing the morality of risk. Risk is often treated as a subjective interpretation of the unknown, in which persons typically weigh the known or identifiable benefits of an action against the hypothetical or predictable negative consequences of an action. But there are many more questions that go into risk assessment that, frankly, our minds aren't really equipped to compute. If we were to truly be mindful of risk in determining moral action, we need to account to a much greater degree for things such as proximity, scope, and time. For example, when I get in my car and I leave work and I'm getting ready to move the car, I observe whether the car is working correctly, check my immediate surroundings, and if I don't feel odd about anything or I don't feel like I'm sick or ill, I'll start to move the car. I don't think about whether in 15 minutes how I could get distracted by some event that results in me being involved in an accident and could injure myself or others. I recognize this is always a possibility, but I don't elect not to drive because of the continuous threat that I could end up dying or severely injuring or killing another person on my way home. I'm not psychologically equipped to imagine and calculate my actions through all those potential realities prior at the beginning of my drive home. Obviously, what I'm intimating is that there's a lot more to say about risk assessment in terms of personal obligations than I'm able to sufficiently address in this talk. And that I am concerned that when we talk about risk, no matter how seemingly small, we tend to minimize or rationalize it as, well, every action has risk or an unknown or unforeseen consequence, so whatever. What worries me is that risk sits at the crux of the debate over vaccine mandates and has not been and may not be properly addressed. And the reason I say this ties back into the public health aspect of vaccine mandates. In short, an unstated and unexplored aspect of vaccine mandate proponents is an idea that vaccines present an opportunity to minimize risk of COVID-19. especially toward vulnerable persons, and that risk minimization of harm is itself a priori valuable. Those who oppose vaccine mandates essentially contend that while risk minimization may be worthwhile, being alive and interacting with others regularly has innate risk, and that risk of harm caused by COVID-19 or any disease for that matter is not sufficient to value risk avoidance and potential harm over individual liberty. In the extreme version, some vaccine mandate opponents do oppose other public health measures that limit individual liberty. And the reason I'm pausing for a second is I told you earlier on, I was just coming from a meeting where we were looking at different rationales around exemptions for getting COVID-19 vaccine. And one of the people I was talking to was raising this point. We've had patients die here of COVID-19 post-vaccination, right? Many institutions have. And in talking with those patients who are unvaccinated, which frankly is the majority of them now in the ICUs, they'll say, I'm happy I didn't get vaccinated. I would still rather this be my outcome than get vaccinated because gosh darn it, you're not going to tell me what to do. So whether you agree or disagree, it's out there. Unfortunately, we can't make people value things differently. And arguments in favor of mandates I don't think actually need to go that far, though, of trying to get people to have a different value system. They do need to go far enough to address the concerns of risk. Likewise, the concern about historical injustice as it related to vaccine mandates can't be addressed simply by appealing to ethical and moral norms in the realms of business, medicine, and public health. One thing we know about historical injustice is that if the structures that have propagated the injustice have not changed, arguments stemming from those realms are not going to be persuasive to those who have been systematically wronged by the structures to begin with. I understand and appreciate that. Trust must be earned and demonstrated over time. The structures have to change prior to expecting the principles, values, and norms supporting those structures being adopted by those who have been systematically wronged by them. Obviously, I think these two concerns are difficult to overcome. And frankly, I'm not sure I have a good response, but I do have a response. Earlier, I brought up an op-ed that has been accepted by Health Affairs, which is pretty awesome. My two co-authors, Jason Eberl and Matt Winia, make the point that there are multiple secular and religious worldviews that support individuals being required to accept some risk or sacrifice of personal comfort or well-being to help others. And that for many religious traditions, responsibility to help others who are more vulnerable is a central tenet. And I agree, but I politely disagree. While I think the point supports a normative claim, I'm not sure it supports an enforceable requirement. We know, for example, that while many religious leaders support the COVID-19 vaccination, some still oppose or remain silent on vaccine mandates. However, I think a feminist case-based approach may get to a requirement or at least closer to it in a way that addresses both risk and concerns about historical injustice. Under this type of argumentative framework, the issue about vaccine mandates is not oriented to a global concept of humanity for humanity's sake or other set of abstract principles, but around personal relationships individuals have with their loved ones. The central tenet here is that not only do individuals have moral standing, but so do their relationships. And those relationships are integral to our own identity formation. For example, pregnant women intent on having the child accept the personal risk as well as potential discomfort and pain inherent to the birthing and recovery process. In other types of relationships, persons often accept choice limits for the sake of the relationship. And there is risk inherent in accepting those limits. That's part of being human. We rely on close friends and loved ones when we're in need of help, and likewise, they rely on us. As a parent, when my child is sick, I care for my child, even though I might also get sick. If a friend of mine slips while standing near me, I'm going to try to catch that person rather than let them fall, even though I could get hurt too. How this gets at historical injustice is that it does not require accepting principles, values, or norms that have been unfairly applied institutionally and structurally throughout history. It simply asks persons to consider those whom they love and accept having that having and maintaining personal relationships requires us to accept trade-offs, that we express our love to others by doing things to benefit them that sometimes not only fail to benefit us personally, but cause us discomfort, grief, and various forms of harm, kind of like Olaf melting away. Again, whether this argument is good enough to get us to broadly accepted vaccine mandates for all eligible persons outside of employment structures, I don't know. The argument needs more thought in how it's applied. The last thing I want to do before I end is turn things over to you all, or the last thing I want to do before I turn things over to you all is to address a couple of questions and 2 points that I don't really have time to sufficiently address in this talk, but are important to consider regarding vaccine mandates. The first is enforceability. What I've addressed in this talk is theoretical arguments against and for vaccine mandates. From a practical side, implementation and success of vaccine mandates can vary. Mandates favor large institutions with the power and resources to effect change. As it stands right now, there are no laws regarding COVID-19 vaccination mandates. Policy, yes. Law, no. When mandates are implemented in the realm of business by small employers, there's a risk of attrition, and a risk of attrition of workers that might affect those organizations far more than larger organizations that can absorb staffing shortages. As an ethicist at a mid-sized hospital in the upper Midwest of the United States, that's a worry of mine, right? You mandate a vaccine, how many staff are you willing to lose in order to make sure that that vaccine mandate stays in effect? And what exemptions do you have? Smaller hospitals, rural hospitals, especially in the northern parts of Wisconsin, will never implement a mandate for vaccine because they don't want to risk their staff leaving and not having enough people to care for the ill and sick patients who are coming to the hospital. The second is a somewhat different issue altogether about requiring vaccination as a condition of treatment in medical facilities and acceptance of patients into nursing facilities post-hospitalization. In this picture, you see Dr. Jason Valentine from Mobile, Alabama, who took this picture and shared it on Facebook a month ago. Right? And it said, effective October 1st, Dr. Valentine will no longer see patients that are not vaccinated against COVID-19. Here, medical paternalism risks rearing its ugly head. From a medical standpoint, it can be reasonable not to provide certain treatments if a patient is not vaccinated. Chemotherapy and organ transplantation, for example, create an immunocompromised state. But as a practice, we want to make sure that we distinguish between decisions not to treat based on what's medically reasonable versus decisions not to treat because providers are resentful of a person's decision not to be vaccinated. Again, this is a different talk for a different day. But what I will say is with Dr. Valentine, the reason he said he wasn't going to treat those who aren't vaccinated was an expressed frustration with the low number of vaccination rate, or the low vaccination rate in Mobile. All right, so that's it. That's it for me. So this penultimate slide is a non-exhaustive list of references. There's certainly a lot more. And this final slide is a flyby of my community and of Gunderson. And after we're done today, if you have any follow-up questions, comments, or observations that we don't get to in the Q&A, feel free to contact me. I'll be happy to chat more with you, email or phone. And that's it. So thanks for your time.